2 years after leaving Riverside Psychiatric Facility, Margaret stood in the greenhouse of Evergreen Garden Center in Cedar Falls, Oregon, carefully tending to a collection of seedlings that would soon become someone's garden. The work was simple, but satisfying, and Margaret found peace in nurturing things that grew toward the light instead of plodding in darkness. Her life in Cedar Falls was quiet and deliberately small. She rented a modest apartment above the local bakery, maintained regular sessions with Dr. Martinez, her psychiatrist, and had slowly begun to build tentative friendships with her coworkers. She volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends and had adopted a rescue dog named Hope, who seemed to sense Margaret's need for unconditional companionship. Margaret had kept her promise to Dr. Chen about remaining vigilant against her old patterns of thinking. When she felt the familiar stirrings of jealousy or paranoia, she used the tools she had learned in therapy. She practiced mindfulness meditation, wrote in her journal, and most importantly, she talked to people instead of retreating into her own suspicious thoughts. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of what she had done to Tom felt so heavy that she could barely get out of bed. There were nights when she woke up in a cold sweat, dreaming about dirt, falling on her face while she clawed desperately at wooden walls. But she had learned to sit with these feelings instead of fighting them, to acknowledge her guilt without letting it consume her completely. On this particular Tuesday morning, Margaret was surprised when her supervisor, Ellen, approached her with an unusual request. A man had called asking specifically for Margaret, claiming to be an old friend who had heard she was working at the garden center. Ellen seemed puzzled by the call, as Margaret had never mentioned having friends from her previous life. Margaret's blood ran cold as she considered the possibilities. Very few people knew where she had moved, and most of those who did would have no reason to contact her. Her first thought was that something had happened to Robert, but Ellen said the caller had given his name as Tom Bradley. For a moment, Margaret thought she might faint. Tom Bradley, the man she had buried alive, had somehow found her new life and wanted to speak with her. The parole-like conditions of their private agreement explicitly prohibited Margaret from contacting Tom, but there had been no restriction on him contacting her. Still, Margaret couldn't imagine any good reason why Tom would want to speak with her. Ellen handed Margaret a slip of paper with a phone number written on it. He said to call him back when you had a chance. He seemed nice enough, but you look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right? Margaret forced herself to nod and accepted the paper with trembling hands. She told Ellen she needed to take her lunch break early and retreated to the small office behind the greenhouse. Her hands shook as she dialed the number, and she had to start over twice before successfully completing the call. Tom answered on the second ring, and the sound of his voice transported Margaret instantly back to that horrible morning in her backyard. But his tone was calm, almost gentle, which only increased her confusion and anxiety. Margaret, Tom said when she identified herself. Thank you for calling me back. I know this must be a shock. Tom, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Why are you calling me? Did something happen to Robert? Is he all right? Robert is fine, Tom assured her quickly. This call is about me, actually, and about you. Margaret, I need to tell you something that I've been carrying around for 2 years now, and I can't carry it anymore. Margaret sank into Ellen's desk chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. I don't understand. Tom was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could hear him taking a deep breath. Margaret, I lied to you and Robert that day about not remembering how I got into the storm cellar. I lied because I was terrified and humiliated, and I wanted someone to pay for what had happened to me. The world seemed to tilt around Margaret as she processed Tom's words. What do you mean you lied? Tom, I drugged you. I buried you alive. I remember doing it. No, Tom said firmly. You didn't. Margaret, I was never unconscious. I never drank any drugged coffee. I was in your backyard that night because I had been drinking heavily at home, and I was looking for an excuse to avoid going back to my empty house. I saw the storm cellar was open, and I climbed down to explore it. I was drunk and stupid, and I fell asleep down there. Margaret felt like she was falling through space. But you were unconscious on my couch. I put the sleeping pills in Robert's coffee, And you drank it. Margaret, listen to me carefully. You put sleeping pills in a coffee mug and left it on the kitchen counter. But you never gave it to anyone. I found you sleepwalking in your backyard at around midnight, moving dirt around like you were burying something. You were completely unconscious, acting out some kind of nightmare. The phone nearly slipped from Margaret's fingers as the implications of Tom's words sank in. Sleepwalking? You were having some kind of episode. I tried to wake you up, but you seemed terrified and confused. You kept talking about Robert and Linda and how you had to make him understand. When you finally came out of it, you looked at me like you'd never seen me before in your life. Then you ran back into the house. Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to reconcile Tom's version of events with her own memories. But even as she struggled to understand, pieces began falling into place. The strange gaps in her memory from that night. The way the drugged coffee mug had been sitting untouched on the counter when Robert came home. The fact that she had somehow managed to move what she thought was Robert's unconscious body, despite her small frame. But the next morning, Margaret said weakly, you were in the storm cellar. You were traumatized. You had scratches on your hands. Tom's voice grew sad. I went back down into the cellar after you went inside because I was trying to figure out what you had been doing. I was drunk and curious and I slipped and fell. I couldn't climb back out because the ladder had shifted. I spent the night down there, but Margaret, you didn't put me there. I put myself there. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. For 2 years, she had been carrying the guilt of attempting to murder an innocent man. She had destroyed her marriage, lost her home, and exiled herself from her community based on a crime that existed only in her own traumatized mind. Why didn't you tell me this before? Margaret whispered. Why did you let me think I had tried to kill you? Tom was quiet for a long moment, because at first I wasn't sure what had really happened. You seemed so convinced that you had drugged me, and I was so shaken up from spending the night in that hole. And then, when I saw how guilty you felt, how destroyed you were by what you thought you had done, I guess I wanted you to suffer the way I had suffered. Margaret began to cry. Not tears of relief, but tears of a deeper, more complex grief. Tom, I gave up everything. My marriage, my home, my entire life. I committed myself to a psychiatric facility. I've spent 2 years believing I was capable of murder. I know, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. And Margaret, I am so sorry. I've been seeing a therapist about what happened that night, and she helped me understand that what I did to you was cruel and wrong. I let my own pain turn me into someone I didn't recognize, just like your fear and jealousy had done to you. Margaret tried to process the magnitude of what Tom was telling her. Her attempted murder had been a sleepwalking episode, a manifestation of the psychological breakdown she had been experiencing. She was not a would-be killer. She had not drugged an innocent man. She had not buried anyone alive. But even as relief flooded through her, Margaret realized that in some ways the truth changed nothing. She had still planned to murder Robert. She had still purchased sleeping pills with the intent to use them as weapons. The fact that she had acted out her murderous fantasies in a dream state rather than in waking life didn't erase the darkness that had consumed her mind. Margaret, Tom continued, I'm calling because I want to make this right. I've already spoken to Robert and explained everything. He wants to talk to you if you're willing, and I want to help you reclaim your life. The house transfer, the exile from Millbrook, all of it was based on a lie that I allowed to continue. Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions flowing through her. Gratitude, anger, relief, and confusion all battled for dominance in her chest. The man she had believed she victimized was offering her redemption, but Margaret wasn't sure she deserved it. The intent to commit murder had been real, even if the act itself had been imaginary. 3 months had passed since the incident, and Margaret found herself sitting in a stark white room at Riverside Psychiatric Facility, staring out the window at a world that felt foreign to her now. The woman who had once been known as the friendly florist of Millbrook was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. The doctors called her progress encouraging, but Margaret wondered if she would ever feel normal again. Dr. Sarah Chen, her psychiatrist, sat across from her during their daily session. reviewing Margaret's charts with practiced professionalism. Margaret had grown to respect Dr. Chen over the past months, even though their conversations forced her to confront the darkest parts of herself. "You seem more settled today," Dr. Chen observed. "How are you feeling about the discharge paperwork we discussed yesterday?" Margaret shifted in her chair, still uncomfortable with the idea of leaving the safety of the facility. Here she was surrounded by others who understood what it meant to lose control of your own mind. Here, her attempted murder was treated as a symptom of illness rather than pure evil, though Margaret wasn't sure she believed that distinction herself. "I'm scared," Margaret admitted. "What if I can't handle the real world? What if these feelings come back?" Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression gentle but serious. "Margaret, you've made tremendous progress. You've learned to identify the warning signs of obsessive thinking. You've developed coping strategies for managing jealousy and paranoia. Most importantly, you've taken full responsibility for what you did to Tom." Margaret nodded, though the weight of that responsibility still felt crushing. She had written letters to Tom apologizing for what she had put him through, though she never sent them. Robert had told her that Tom was still receiving therapy and that he had moved into their old house, though he had installed a security system and barely spoke to the other neighbors. "Have you thought more about where you'll go when you're discharged, Doctor?" Chen asked. Margaret had thought about little else. Robert had filed for divorce 2 months ago, though he continued to pay for her treatment and had helped arrange for the sale of her flower shop. The proceeds, along with their savings, would give her enough money to start over somewhere new. She had been researching small towns in other states, places where no one would know her story. "I've been looking at a town called Cedar Falls in Oregon," Margaret said. "It's small, quiet. There's a position available at a garden center there. I thought I might apply." Dr. Chen made a note in her file. "That sounds like a good plan. But Margaret, I want you to understand that geographic relocation isn't a cure for what you're dealing with. These patterns of thinking can resurface anywhere, especially under stress." Margaret knew Dr. Chen was right. The jealousy and paranoia that had consumed her weren't tied to Millbrook or to Robert specifically. They were part of her, patterns of thinking that had probably been developing for years before they finally exploded into violence. She would have to remain vigilant against them for the rest of her life. "I've been thinking about Tom a lot lately," Margaret said quietly. "About what those hours must have been like for him down in that cellar." This was something they had discussed extensively in therapy. Margaret's ability to empathize with Tom's suffering was seen as a positive development, a sign that she was reconnecting with her capacity for genuine remorse rather than just self-pity. "Tell me what you imagine he experienced," Dr. Chen prompted. Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself to confront the full horror of what she had done. He woke up in complete darkness, not knowing where he was or how he got there. He probably called for help until his voice was hoarse. He would have tried to find a way out, clawing at the dirt until his hands bled. He must have thought he was going to die there. The image made Margaret feel physically ill, but Dr. Chen had taught her that avoiding these thoughts only gave them more power. She had to face what she had done fully and completely if she hoped to ensure it never happened again. "And how does it feel to sit with that knowledge?" Dr. Chen asked. "It feels unbearable," Margaret whispered. "But I know that's appropriate. It should feel unbearable. I did something unforgivable to an innocent person." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's a healthy response, Margaret. The fact that you can feel the full weight of what you did, without minimizing it or making excuses, suggests that your empathy is functioning properly again." They spent the rest of the session discussing Margaret's discharge plan in detail. She would move to Cedar Falls within the month, continue therapy with a local psychiatrist Dr. Chen had recommended, and check in by phone every week for the first 6 months. Margaret would also continue taking the medication that had helped stabilize her moods and reduce the obsessive thoughts that had dominated her life. After the session, Margaret returned to her room and found a letter waiting on her bed. She recognized Robert's handwriting on the envelope, and her heart began to race. They hadn't spoken in person since the day she was admitted to the facility, though he had sent occasional updates about practical matters. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well and that your treatment is progressing. I wanted to write to you before your discharge to say some things that I couldn't say in person. First, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I know that might be hard to believe given everything that's happened, but it's true. The woman who buried Tom alive isn't the woman I married 12 years ago. That woman was kind, generous, and incapable of hurting anyone. I choose to remember her rather than let what happened at the end define our entire marriage. I also want you to know that I'm partly to blame for what happened. I should have seen that you were struggling. I should have noticed that you were becoming consumed by jealousy and paranoia. I was so focused on work and on surprising you with that trip that I missed all the warning signs. If I had been paying attention, maybe none of this would have happened. Tom is doing better, though he still has nightmares. He's working with a therapist, and he's slowly beginning to feel safe in his own home again. He asked me to tell you that he doesn't want revenge, but he does want you to use this experience to become someone who could never hurt another person the way you hurt him. I won't pretend that I'll ever fully understand what drove you to do what you did. The doctors explain it as a kind of mental breakdown brought on by years of suppressed insecurity and jealousy. I accept that explanation, but it doesn't make the reality any easier to process. What I hope you'll take from this experience is the knowledge that love can't exist without trust and trust can't exist without honest communication. If you had simply talked to me about your concerns instead of letting them fester in secret, none of this would have happened. I wish you well in your new life, Margaret. I hope you find peace and happiness, and I hope you use what you've learned to build healthy relationships based on honesty rather than suspicion, with genuine hope for your future, Robert. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Robert's kindness, even after everything she had put him through, only made her guilt more acute. He was giving her permission to forgive herself, but Margaret wasn't sure she deserved that gift. As she prepared for sleep that night, Margaret made a decision. She would not waste the second chance she was being given. She would move to Cedar Falls and build a life dedicated to making amends for what she had done. She couldn't undo the trauma she had inflicted on Tom, but she could make sure that her remaining years were spent trying to put more good into the world than she had taken out of it. For the first time since the incident, Margaret felt something that might have been hope. It was fragile and uncertain, like a candle flame in the wind, but it was real. She would never be able to forgive herself completely for what she had done, but perhaps she could learn to live with the weight of it. Perhaps she could become someone worthy of Robert's forgiveness and Tom's mercy. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Margaret was finally ready to walk it. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the monsters we fear most are often the ones we create ourselves, and the only way to defeat them is to face them with unflinching honesty and unwavering determination to be better. The silence that followed Margaret's confession was deafening. Tom sat on the ground, still trembling from his ordeal, while Robert stared at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. Margaret remained on her knees, unable to meet either man's eyes, knowing that her life as she knew it was over. Tom was the first to break the silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "I need to call the police." "No," Robert said quickly, surprising both Tom and Margaret. "Wait. Please, just let's think about this for a minute." Tom looked at Robert incredulously. "Think about what?" "Your wife drugged me and buried me alive. I spent hours thinking I was going to die down there. I clawed at the dirt until my fingernails bled, screaming for help that I thought would never come." Margaret flinched at Tom's words, each one a reminder of the horror she had inflicted on an innocent man. She could see the scratches on his hands, the terror still lingering in his eyes. She had done that to him. She had turned a kind neighbor into a traumatized victim because of her own twisted fantasies. "I know how this looks," Robert said, his voice strained. "And I'm not defending what Margaret did. It's inexcusable. But Tom, if you call the police right now, Margaret will go to prison for attempted murder. Her life will be destroyed." "Her life?" Tom's voice rose in disbelief. "What about my life? What about what I went through down there?" Robert held up his hands in a placating gesture. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm asking for a chance to make this right. Let me help Margaret get the psychiatric help she clearly needs. Let me make sure you're compensated for what you've been through." Tom stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his clothes. Compensated? You think money can make up for what happened to me? I thought I was going to suffocate down there. I wrote goodbye, messages to my family in the dirt because I thought no one would ever find me. The weight of Tom's words settled over them like a blanket of shame. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant for this to happen to you. But you meant for it to happen to Robert, Tom shot back. You planned to bury your own husband alive because you imagined he was cheating on you. How does that make it any better? Margaret had no answer for that. The truth was that it didn't make it better at all. She had planned to commit murder, and the only reason Tom was the victim instead of Robert was a case of mistaken identity. The intent had been just as evil, just as inexcusable. Robert knelt down beside Margaret, his face a mixture of grief and confusion. Why didn't you just talk to me? If you thought I was having an affair, why didn't you ask me about it? I saw you, Margaret said through her tears. I saw you with Linda, the way you looked at her, the way you touched her back when you opened the door for her. You were so gentle with her. You haven't looked at me that way in years. Margaret? She had hurt her back moving boxes. I was being careful not to bump into her injury. And yes, I've been distant lately, but it's because I've been working extra hours to save up money. I wanted to surprise you with a trip to Italy for our anniversary. Remember how you used to talk about wanting to see the Tuscan countryside? The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Not only had Robert not been cheating, but he had been working extra hours to plan something special for her. She had destroyed their marriage, traumatized an innocent man, and nearly committed murder, all based on her own paranoid misinterpretation of innocent interactions. Tom watched this exchange with a mixture of anger and pity. This is all very touching, he said bitterly, but it doesn't change what happened to me. I need medical attention. I need therapy. And I need justice. Robert stood up, his jaw set with determination. You're right. You deserve all of those things. But Tom, I'm begging you to consider an alternative to calling the police right now. Let me take Margaret to a psychiatric facility today. Let me get you the best medical care available. Let me transfer ownership of our house to you as compensation for what you've suffered. Margaret looked up at Robert in shock. The house? Robert, you can't. Yes, I can, Robert interrupted. It's the least we can do. Tom, you've lived next door for 5 years. You know this isn't who Margaret normally is. She's been acting strange for weeks, and I should have seen the signs. I should have gotten her help before it came to this. Tom was quiet for a long moment, considering Robert's proposal. Finally, he spoke. I want a written agreement. I want Margaret committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. I want all medical and therapy expenses covered. And I want the house deed transferred to me within 1 week. Done, Robert said without hesitation. And if Margaret ever comes near me again, if she ever contacts me or threatens me in any way, I'm calling the police immediately. The statute of limitations on attempted murder is long, Robert. This isn't going away just because we're handling it privately. Margaret nodded frantically. I understand. I won't come near you. I won't even stay in Millbrook once I'm released from treatment. I'll move away, start over somewhere else. Tom looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret could see him weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly. I need to shower and change clothes. Then I'm going to the hospital to get checked out. Robert, I want that written agreement by tomorrow morning, signed by both of you and notarized. You'll have it, Robert promised. Tom started walking toward his own house, then turned back. Margaret, I hope you get the help you need. But I also hope you understand that there are consequences for what you've done. You may have avoided prison, but you're going to lose everything else. Your marriage, your home, your place in this community. That's the price of letting jealousy turn you into a monster. As Tom disappeared into his house, Margaret and Robert were left alone in the backyard where it had all happened. The storm cellar yawned open behind them like a mouth, and Margaret couldn't look at it without seeing Tom's terrified face staring up at her. I've destroyed everything, Margaret whispered. Robert was quiet for a long time before responding. Yes, you have. But Margaret, we're going to get you help. We're going to make sure this never happens again. What about us? Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Robert's silence was answer enough. Their marriage was over. Even if Margaret got treatment, even if she learned to control the jealousy and paranoia that had consumed her, Robert would never be able to trust her again. He would always know that his wife had been capable of murder, that she had planned to bury him alive over an imagined affair. As they walked back to the house to begin making the arrangements that would dismantle their life together, Margaret realized that in trying to save her marriage from a threat that existed only in her mind, she had destroyed it completely. The irony was bitter and complete, and it would haunt her for the rest of her life. Margaret stared at Robert as though he were a ghost, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. He looked tired, and his clothes were wrinkled, as if he had slept in them, but he was undeniably alive and standing in front of her. The coffee mug from the night before lay shattered at her feet, forgotten in her panic to dig up what she had thought was her husband's grave. Margaret, what on earth are you doing? Robert asked, his voice filled with genuine concern as he took in her disheveled appearance and the disturbed earth around her. I've been calling you all morning. When you didn't answer, I got worried and came home early. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. If Robert was here, then who had she dragged to the storm cellar last night? The memory came flooding back with horrible clarity. The figure on the couch unconscious from the drugged coffee, the dead weight she had struggled to move, the face she had barely looked at in the darkness, assuming it was Robert because it was Robert's coffee mug, Robert's usual spot on the couch. I thought. Margaret stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked back at the disturbed dirt, then at Robert's confused face. Where were you last night? Robert ran a hand through his hair, looking embarrassed. I fell asleep at the office. I know I should have called, but it was so late when I realized what happened. I just crashed on the couch in the break room. Linda found me there this morning, when she came in early to finish some paperwork. The mention of Linda's name sent a fresh wave of panic through Margaret. If Robert had been at the office all night, and Linda had found him this morning, then Linda couldn't have been with him, either. But if Linda wasn't with Robert and Robert wasn't at home, then who? The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Margaret remembered now how she had barely glanced at the figure on the couch before administering the drugged coffee. She had assumed it was Robert because he was supposed to be there, because she expected him to be there. But what if someone else had been in her house? Margaret, you're scaring me, Robert said, moving closer. What's wrong? What are you doing with all this dirt? Before Margaret could answer, they heard a sound that made both of them freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the ground where Margaret had been digging. Someone was down there and they were still alive. Robert's eyes widened as the realization hit him. Oh God, Margaret, what have you done? Without waiting for an answer, Robert grabbed the shovel from Margaret's trembling hands and began digging with desperate efficiency. The tapping grew stronger as he worked, as though whoever was trapped below could hear the sound of rescue coming. Help me, Robert commanded, his voice tight with fear. Margaret snapped out of her paralysis and began scooping away dirt with her bare hands. The loose soil that had seemed so stubborn when she dug alone now seemed to fly away under their combined efforts. After 20 minutes of frantic digging, Robert's shovel hit something solid, the wooden cover of the storm cellar. They cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal the old wooden planks, and immediately they could hear muffled shouts coming from below. Hold on, Robert called down, his voice cracking with emotion. We're getting you out. It took both of them to lift the heavy wooden cover, and when they did, a blast of stale, humid air rushed out. Robert shone his phone's flashlight down into the hole, and Margaret nearly fainted at what she saw. It was Tom Bradley, their next-door neighbor. He was alive but in terrible condition, his clothes torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He was sitting against the cellar wall, having clearly been conscious for hours, trapped in what he must have thought was his tomb. Tom! Robert exclaimed, immediately lowering the ladder into the hole. "Jesus, how did you get down?" "There." Tom looked up at them with haunted eyes, his voice hoarse from shouting for help. I don't remember. I came over last night to borrow your hedge trimmer. The back door was open, so I came in to find you. I saw someone had left coffee on the table, and I was so tired from working in my yard all day. I just sat down for a minute and had a sip, and the next thing I knew, I woke up down here." Margaret's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees beside the hole. Tom had drunk Robert's coffee. Tom had been the unconscious figure she had dragged through the dark house. Tom was the innocent man she had buried alive in a fit of jealous rage. Robert was already climbing down the ladder to help Tom, but he shot Margaret a look of horror and confusion. "How did he get down there, Margaret? The ladder was already in place when I got here." Tom managed to climb up with Robert's help, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. Once he was on solid ground, he looked between Margaret and Robert with growing understanding in his eyes. "You did this," he said to Margaret, his voice barely containing his rage. "You drugged me and buried me alive. I could have died down there." Margaret couldn't speak. The full weight of what she had almost done crashed down on her like a physical blow. She had nearly murdered an innocent man because of her own paranoia and jealousy. Tom Bradley, who had been nothing but kind to her for the 5 years he had, lived next door, who had helped her carry groceries when Robert was working late, who had never done anything to deserve such a fate. I thought you were Robert," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I saw him with another woman. I thought he was cheating on me. I just wanted to teach him a lesson." Tom stared at her in disbelief. "You wanted to bury your husband alive because you thought he was having an affair?" Robert looked between his wife and his neighbor, pieces of the puzzle still coming together in his mind. "Margaret, I'm not having an affair. Linda is just a colleague. We were working on a presentation for the regional banking conference. All those late nights, all those meetings, it was work." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She had been wrong about everything. Robert wasn't cheating. Linda wasn't stealing her husband. She had created an entire fantasy of betrayal in her mind and had nearly killed an innocent man because of it. But even as the truth sank in, Margaret realized that her problems were just beginning. Tom was alive, but he had been buried for hours, traumatized beyond measure. Robert now knew exactly what his wife was capable of. And worst of all, Margaret herself had to face the terrifying reality of what jealousy had turned her into. Margaret's transformation from heartbroken wife to calculating predator happened gradually over the following weeks. She maintained her normal routine during the day, running the flower shop with practiced efficiency, but her evenings were spent in careful planning. She researched sleeping pills online, learning about dosages and effects. She studied the layout of their property, measuring distances and noting sight lines from neighboring houses. The plan that emerged was both simple and terrifying. Margaret would drug Robert's evening coffee with enough sleeping pills to render him unconscious but not kill him. She would then drag him to the old storm cellar behind their house, a relic from the previous owners that Robert had always meant to fill in but never got around to. She would bury him alive, leaving him to experience the suffocating panic she felt every day knowing about his betrayal. Margaret told herself she would dig him up after a few hours once he had learned his lesson about the consequences of infidelity. She convinced herself this was about teaching him respect, about making him appreciate what he had. But deep down, in a place she refused to examine too closely, she wasn't sure she would be strong enough to stop once she started. The opportunity came on a Friday night in early November. Robert announced that he would be working late at the bank, doing month-end reconciliation. Margaret knew this was likely another lie, another excuse to spend time with Linda, but she nodded and said she would keep dinner warm for him. Instead, she drove to the pharmacy in the next town and purchased a bottle of sleeping pills, claiming she had been having trouble sleeping due to stress. That evening, Margaret prepared Robert's favorite dinner and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. She crushed 6 sleeping pills into powder and stirred them into his mug, adding extra cream and sugar to mask any bitter taste. Her hands were steady as she worked, surprising herself with her calmness. Robert came home at 10:30, smelling faintly of Linda's perfume. He accepted the coffee gratefully, complimenting Margaret on the meal and chatting about his day as though he hadn't spent the last 3 hours with another woman. Margaret watched him drink the coffee slowly, noting when his eyelids began to grow heavy and his speech started to slur slightly. By 11:15, Robert was unconscious on the living room couch. Margaret checked his pulse and breathing, then went to the garage to retrieve the wheelbarrow and several lengths of rope. The hardest part was getting Robert's dead weight from the couch to the wheelbarrow, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The journey to the storm cellar took 20 minutes. Margaret had to stop frequently to catch her breath, but eventually she maneuvered the wheelbarrow to the edge of the 8-foot-deep hole. She had already placed a ladder inside earlier that day, along with a flashlight and some bottled water. She told herself these provisions proved she intended to rescue him. Getting Robert down into the cellar required lowering him with ropes, a process that left Margaret's arms aching and her clothes dirty. Once he was at the bottom, she bound his hands and feet, telling herself it was to prevent him from climbing out before she was ready to let him. She placed the water and flashlight within his reach, then climbed back up the ladder. Standing at the edge of the hole, Margaret looked down at her unconscious husband. In the beam of her own flashlight, he looked pale and vulnerable. For a moment, doubt crept in. This was Robert, the man she had married 12 years ago, who still brought her flowers from the garden when she was sad. But then she remembered Linda's laugh and the tender way he had kissed her, and her resolve hardened. Margaret began shoveling dirt into the hole. She had purchased the dirt earlier that week, telling the garden center employee she was planting a large flower bed. The soil was loose and easy to work with, but it still took her over 2 hours to fill the cellar completely. By the time she finished, her back ached and her hands were raw with blisters. She stamped down the dirt and covered it with fallen leaves, making the area look as natural as possible. Then she returned to the house, showered, and went to bed. She set her alarm for 6 in the morning, calculating that Robert would have been unconscious for about 7 hours by then. She would dig him up, and he would have learned his lesson about the consequences of betrayal. But Margaret slept through her alarm. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the night caught up with her, and she didn't wake until nearly 10 in the morning. Panic seized her as she realized how much time had passed. She threw on clothes and ran to the backyard, grabbing a shovel on the way. The sight that greeted her made her blood turn cold. The carefully arranged leaves had been disturbed, and there were scratch marks in the dirt as though something had been digging from underneath. More terrifying still was the silence. No sounds of movement or calls for help came from below the surface. Margaret began digging frantically, her careful plan forgotten in her desperation to reach Robert. But the more she dug, the more the loose soil seemed to collapse back into itself. It was like trying to dig through quicksand, and with each shovelful her panic grew stronger. After an hour of frantic digging, Margaret had made little progress. Her hands were bleeding now and her strength was failing. She tried calling Robert's name, pressing her ear to the ground, but heard nothing in response. The horrible possibility that she had waited too long began to creep into her consciousness. That's when she heard the car in the driveway. Margaret looked up to see Robert's sedan pulling up to the house. Through the windshield, she could see Robert himself behind the wheel, very much alive and looking confused as he spotted her kneeling in the dirt of the backyard. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. If Robert was in the car, then who had she, buried in the storm cellar? The shovel fell from her nerveless fingers as Robert got out of the car and walked toward her, calling out to ask what she was doing. But Margaret couldn't hear his words over the roaring in her ears as the full horror of what she might have done crashed down on her. Margaret Thompson had always been the kind of woman who noticed everything. She noticed when her husband Robert came home 15 minutes later than usual. She noticed when he started wearing cologne to work. She noticed when he began checking his phone with a small smile she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Their marriage of 12 years had settled into a comfortable routine in their small town of Millbrook. Robert worked at the local bank, and Margaret managed the town's only flower shop. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, where Margaret tended to her prized rose garden, and Robert fixed whatever needed fixing around the house. To their neighbors, they seemed like any other middle-aged couple navigating the quiet challenges of married life. But Margaret's keen observation skills, which had served her well in business, became a curse in her personal life. She started keeping mental notes of every small change in Robert's behavior. The way he hummed while shaving in the morning, the new aftershave sitting on the bathroom counter, the fact that he suddenly cared about ironing his shirts properly. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Margaret was arranging flowers in the shop when she saw Robert walking down Main Street with Linda Hayes, the new teller who had started at the bank 3 months ago. Linda was everything Margaret felt she wasn't anymore. 28 years old with flowing auburn hair and a laugh that carried across the street. They weren't holding hands, but they walked close together, their heads bent in intimate conversation. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the white roses she'd been arranging. She watched through the shop window as Robert opened the door to Miller's Diner for Linda, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. It was a gesture so familiar that Margaret's heart clenched. He used to do that for her when they were dating. That night, Margaret confronted Robert over dinner. She tried to keep her voice casual as she mentioned seeing him with Linda. Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw something flicker in his eyes before he smiled and said, Linda had asked for advice about opening a savings account. His explanation was smooth, practiced, and Margaret knew immediately that it was a lie. Sleep became impossible for Margaret. She would lie awake listening to Robert's steady breathing, wondering how long this had been going on. She started driving by the bank during her lunch breaks, watching for signs of the affair she was now certain existed. She saw them leaving together twice more that week, each sighting adding another layer to her growing obsession. The town of Millbrook was small enough that gossip traveled fast, but Margaret heard nothing. Either they were being incredibly discreet, or people were talking behind her back. Both possibilities made her feel sick with rage and humiliation. She had built a life in this town, had friends at the garden club and the church committee. The thought of them all knowing about Robert's affair while she played the fool was unbearable. Margaret began following Robert more systematically. She learned that he met Linda for coffee at a small cafe 2 towns over every Thursday morning, before work. She discovered that Linda lived in a small apartment above the hardware store, and that Robert's car had been parked there for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon, while Margaret was at her book club meeting. The evidence mounted, but Robert continued to act as though nothing had changed. He still kissed her goodbye in the morning, still asked about her day over dinner, still watched their usual television shows with her in the evening. His ability to maintain this facade only fueled Margaret's anger. She felt like she was living with a stranger who wore her husband's face. Margaret's behavior began to change too. She became short with customers at the flower shop, her usual warmth replaced by distracted efficiency. She stopped cooking Robert's favorite meals and began serving simple dinners with minimal conversation. When he asked if something was wrong, she would smile tightly and say she was just tired. The final confirmation came on a rainy Thursday in October. Margaret had closed the shop early and decided to drive to the cafe where Robert met Linda. She parked across the street and waited, her heart pounding as she watched the entrance. When they emerged together, laughing at something Linda had said, Margaret saw Robert cup Linda's face in his hands and kiss her softly on the lips. The tenderness of the gesture was what broke something inside Margaret. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was gentle, loving, the kind of kiss that spoke of deep affection and shared intimacy. It was the way he used to kiss her when they were young and thought they would love each other forever. Margaret sat in her car for a long time after they had gone their separate ways. The rain drummed against the windshield, and she felt as though she was drowning in her own emotions. Betrayal, rage, and humiliation warred in her chest, but underneath it all was a cold, calculating anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had given Robert the best years of her life. She had supported his career, managed their home, and been a faithful wife. She had never looked at another man, never even entertained the thought of an affair, and this was how he repaid her loyalty. By the time Margaret drove home, her tears had dried and been replaced by something much more dangerous. She looked at their house with new eyes, noting the isolated location at the end of Elm Street, the tall hedges that provided privacy from the neighbors, the large backyard that bordered the woods. Ideas began forming in her mind, dark thoughts that she pushed away but that kept returning with increasing persistence. That night, as Robert slept peacefully beside her, Margaret stared at the ceiling and began planning. She told herself she just wanted to teach him a lesson, to make him understand the pain he had caused her. She didn't yet admit to herself how far she was willing to go to make that happen.